They lost the war. 4 years of bloodshed. 750,000 dead. Total, crushing defeat. But within a single generation, they won something far more powerful. They won the story. This is how the American South transformed devastating defeat into a noble cause, and wrote a myth so convincing that millions still believe it today. April 9, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over. The Confederacy is dead. And the South? The South is devastated beyond recognition. Richmond is ashes. Atlanta is rubble. Charleston is a ghost town. 1 in 4 white Southern men is dead or maimed. The economy has collapsed entirely. 4 million enslaved people are suddenly, irrevocably free. This isn't just military defeat. This is the complete destruction of a civilization built on forced labor and racial hierarchy. Everything they fought for, gone. Everything they believed about themselves, shattered. Imagine waking up in that world. Your husband or father is buried in an unmarked grave in Pennsylvania. Your home is burned. Your money is worthless. The people you enslaved are walking away as free citizens, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. And hovering over everything, a question that haunts every survivor: how do we live with this? How do we tell our children what we did? What we lost? What it all meant? Because here's the thing, they couldn't accept that they had fought to preserve slavery. They couldn't accept that their brothers and fathers and sons had died for the right to own other human beings. They couldn't accept that they were simply, fundamentally, morally wrong. So they did what humans have done since the beginning of time when faced with unbearable truth: they rewrote it. In the years after 1865, there's a narrative vacuum across the South. Every society needs a story to explain itself, especially after catastrophe. 3 competing versions begin to emerge. The federal version is straightforward: a rebellion was crushed, the Union was restored, and slavery was ended. Justice prevailed. Moving on. For the 4 million freed people, it's a story of liberation, incomplete, compromised, and betrayed, but liberation nonetheless. A new beginning. A chance to build lives as free citizens. The story of Reconstruction is their story. But for white Southerners, especially those with power and education and resources, the story is still being written. And they know, they understand instinctively, that whoever controls the narrative will control the future. So they begin to organize. Former Confederate generals gather in memorial societies. Jubal Early becomes the high priest of a new cult devoted to Robert E. Lee. Wealthy white Southern women form groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Ladies' Memorial Associations. Newspaper editors coordinate their messaging. Ministers weave the narrative into Sunday sermons, giving it the weight of divine purpose. These aren't random acts of nostalgia. This isn't just grief or sentimentality. This is a coordinated campaign to win the peace after losing the war. This is strategic. This is intentional. They need a story. And they find one that's absolutely perfect, because it makes them the heroes of their own tragedy. They call it the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause rests on 4 central pillars. 4 lies, really, but lies so skillfully constructed that they'll stand for more than a century. The first pillar: it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. Listen to how brilliantly this works. They take the most specific, undeniable fact of the war, that the South seceded to preserve slavery, and they make it abstract. Philosophical. Almost noble. States' rights. Constitutional principles. The sovereignty of local government against federal tyranny. Who could argue with that? It sounds downright American. But read what they actually said at the time. Read the secession declarations from 1860 and 1861. Mississippi's declaration states it plainly: our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia says the North has denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution. Property, meaning enslaved human beings. Read the Confederate Constitution itself. It explicitly protects slavery. It forbids any Confederate state from ever abolishing it. Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, gave a speech in 1861, the Cornerstone Speech, where he declared that the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. They said it themselves. Clearly, repeatedly, proudly. But after the war? After defeat? States' rights. Constitutional theory. Abstract principles. The cause becomes philosophical, and philosophy is respectable. Philosophy is something you can defend in polite company, something you can teach your children without shame. The second pillar, the Confederates were noble warriors who fought honorably and lost only because they were outnumbered and out-resourced. This is where the cult of Robert E. Lee becomes essential. They need a symbol, and Lee is perfect for it. He looks the part, dignified, white-haired, aristocratic. He opposed secession initially, which gives him a tragic, reluctant quality. He surrendered with grace. He urged reconciliation afterward. So they transform him. He becomes the marble man. The Christian general who fought with a heavy heart for his beloved Virginia. The gentleman soldier who never wanted war but answered duty's call. Honorable in victory, gracious in defeat. Never mind that Lee was personally cruel to the people he enslaved. Never mind his military tactics that sent thousands to pointless deaths. Never mind that he fought to destroy the United States and preserve slavery. None of that matters to the myth. What matters is that Lee becomes a figure you can admire. A figure that makes the cause seem worthy simply because such a man fought for it. The third pillar, the Old South, was a genteel, graceful civilization. A world of moonlight and magnolias, of chivalrous gentlemen and delicate ladies, of faithful slaves who loved their masters. This is perhaps the most insidious lie of all, because it requires the complete erasure of violence. In the mythical Old South, slavery isn't a system of torture, rape, family separation, and murder. It's a benevolent institution where kindly masters care for childlike dependents. Plantations aren't forced labor camps, they're romantic estates where everyone knows their place and everyone is content. The whip disappears from the story. The auction block disappears. The slave patrols and the dogs and the chains, all of it vanishes, replaced by images of happy servants singing in the fields, grateful for the guidance of their betters. This fantasy version of the South isn't just nostalgic. It's necessary. Because if the Old South was beautiful and good, then what was lost in the war wasn't a system of oppression, it was a civilization. And civilizations are worth fighting for. The fourth pillar, Reconstruction, was a tragic era of corruption, tyranny, and chaos, a vindictive Northern occupation that violated Southern rights and gave power to unqualified black people and greedy carpetbaggers. This is the bridge. This is how the lost cause myth becomes useful in the present tense. If Reconstruction was tyranny, if black political participation was corruption, if racial equality was chaos, then the eventual overthrow of Reconstruction wasn't violence and voter suppression. It was redemption. It was white Southerners taking back their rightful place. It was restoring proper order. This narrative turns terrorists into heroes. It turns murderers into defenders of civilization. It turns the violent suppression of black rights into a noble cause in itself. And here's what makes it so powerful: it works. For generations, this becomes the accepted narrative, not just in the South, but across America. Reconstruction becomes known as the tragic era. A failed experiment. A cautionary tale about giving power to people who weren't ready for it. 4 pillars. 4 lies. Together, they form the foundation of a myth that will shape American life for the next 150 years. But myths don't sustain themselves. They need infrastructure. They need institutions. They need people working tirelessly to keep them alive. Enter the United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894. These women, wealthy, educated, organized, understand something crucial: if you want to control the future, you control what children learn. So they get to work. They raise money for monuments, yes, we'll come back to those. But more importantly, they take control of education across the South. They pressure textbook publishers. They influence school boards. They pressure teachers. They create essay contests and scholarships for students who best demonstrate their understanding of the lost cause. They donate books to school libraries, books with titles like A Child's History of the Confederacy and The Old South, Her Romance and Reality. It's a catechism approach. Children in Southern schools recite lost cause doctrine the way they recite multiplication tables. The war was about states' rights. Lee was a noble hero. Reconstruction was tyranny. The Old South was beautiful. Over and over, year after year, until it becomes gospel truth. By the early 1900s, an entire generation has been educated in this mythology. They know it as fact. They'll teach it to their children. They'll defend it against anyone who challenges it. And then come the monuments. Between 1890 and 1920, the South erupts with Confederate monuments. Statues of Lee and Jackson and Davis. Generic Confederate soldiers staring north on courthouse lawns. Obelisks and plaques and memorial halls. Another wave comes in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. These aren't tributes to the dead. The timing makes that clear. These monuments rise during Jim Crow, when black Southerners are being lynched and terrorized and systematically disenfranchised. They rise again when black Southerners demand their rights. The monuments aren't facing the past. They're facing the present. They're placed in town squares, outside courthouses, at the centers of black life. And their message is simple: remember who's in charge here. Remember what happened the last time you challenged us. Remember your place. These are threats carved in stone. And then Hollywood joins the campaign. In 1915, D.W. Griffith releases The Birth of a Nation. It's a technical masterpiece, the first real blockbuster in American film history. And it's pure lost cause propaganda. The film depicts the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. It shows black men, played by white actors in blackface, as violent, lustful threats to white women. It portrays Reconstruction as a nightmare of black incompetence and Northern tyranny. It ends with the Klan riding to the rescue, restoring order and white supremacy. President Woodrow Wilson screens it at the White House. He reportedly says, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." The film is a sensation. It plays in theaters across the country. It revives the Klan, which had been essentially defunct. Membership explodes. In 1939, Gone with the Wind does it again, more subtly, more palatably, but with the same message. The Old South was glorious. Slavery was benign. The war was tragic. Reconstruction was awful. And Scarlett O'Hara, ruthless and immoral, is somehow the hero because she survives. These films take the lost cause national. Then global. They embed it in American popular culture so deeply that it becomes background radiation. People who've never set foot in the South, who have no connection to the Confederacy, absorb this mythology without even realizing it. It's arguably the most successful propaganda campaign in American history. But here's what we need to understand: the lost cause myth was never just about making white Southerners feel better about the past. That was a side benefit. The real purpose was to justify what came next. Because by the 1890s, white Southerners have systematically stripped black citizens of the rights they won after the war. Through violence, through fraud, through laws explicitly designed to circumvent the Constitution, they've created a new system of racial oppression. Jim Crow segregation, disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, racial terror. And the lost cause myth makes it all make sense. If Reconstruction was tyranny, if black political power was corruption and chaos, then Jim Crow isn't oppression. It's restoration of proper order. It's redemption. If black freedom led to disaster, then black subordination is just practical necessity. It's protecting civilization. The myth becomes the justification for everything. For laws that prevent black people from voting. For segregation that keeps black people in separate, inferior schools, hospitals, neighborhoods. For a justice system that treats black lives as worthless. And for violence. Between 1880 and 1940, more than 4,000 black people are lynched in the American South. Thousands more are beaten, driven from their homes, terrorized. And the lost cause provides the narrative framework. These aren't murders. These are defenders of Southern civilization protecting their communities. These are necessary measures to maintain order. To protect white women. To preserve the Southern way of life. In The Birth of a Nation, the Klan are literally the heroes of the story. That's not accidental. That's the logical endpoint of the lost cause myth. If the Old South was noble and Reconstruction was tyranny, then the men who overthrew Reconstruction through violence were heroes. Simple as that. The myth doesn't just hide what the South fought for. It makes possible what the South built afterward. It creates the moral and intellectual framework for an apartheid system that will last nearly a century. And here's the truly staggering thing, the North goes along with it. By the early 1900s, Northern textbooks are teaching lost cause mythology too. Northern politicians embrace the narrative of reconciliation, let's just forget the whole unpleasant business and move on. The federal government abandons black Southerners. The Supreme Court guts the constitutional amendments that guaranteed their rights. The myth becomes national consensus. Two Americas living in two completely different histories, but the lost cause version becomes the dominant one in popular culture, in education, in collective memory. And then the myth faces its greatest challenge. The 1950s and 60s. The Civil Rights Movement. Black Southerners and their allies, people who've been living with the reality behind the myth their entire lives, decide they've had enough. They march. They organize. They sit in at segregated lunch counters. They register to vote despite intimidation and violence. They demand that America confront what it's been pretending not to see. And the lost cause myth is deployed in their defense. Heritage not hate becomes the rallying cry. The Confederate flag isn't a symbol of white supremacy, it's Southern pride. The monuments aren't threats, they're history. States' rights aren't code for segregation, they're constitutional principles. The language evolves, becomes more sophisticated, more carefully calibrated for a national audience that's uncomfortable with explicit racism. But the core remains the same: the South was right, the war was noble, the cause was just, and the current racial hierarchy is the natural order of things. It doesn't work completely. The civil rights movement wins enormous victories. Legal segregation falls. The Voting Rights Act passes. The moral clarity of the movement, of people being beaten for trying to vote, of children needing federal troops just to go to school, is too powerful for the myth to fully contain. But the myth doesn't die. It adapts. It waits. In the decades that follow, you can trace its influence. In the continued reverence for Confederate symbols. In the resistance to removing monuments. In the way textbooks still hedge and euphemize when discussing slavery. In the way people still insist the war was about states' rights, that the South had valid reasons, that it was all very complicated. The myth evolves but survives, passed down through generations, reinforced by tradition and ritual and the simple human desire not to believe that your ancestors fought for something evil. But myths, no matter how powerful, eventually crack when they hit the truth. Something shifts in the 2010s. Maybe it's generational change. Maybe it's technology making information harder to control. Maybe it's the visible deaths of black men and women at the hands of police, captured on video, impossible to deny. Whatever the cause, the reckoning begins. In 2015, a white supremacist murders 9 black worshippers in Charleston, South Carolina. He's photographed with Confederate flags. He's marinated in lost cause mythology. And suddenly, those flags and monuments look different to people who'd always been told they were just history. In 2017, white supremacists march in Charlottesville, Virginia, to protest the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. They chant Nazi slogans. They carry torches. One of them murders a counter-protester with his car. The mask is fully off now. The connection between Confederate symbols and contemporary white supremacy is undeniable. And people start asking uncomfortable questions. Monuments start coming down. Slowly at first, then faster. The United Daughters of the Confederacy loses its grip on public spaces. Schools and military bases named for Confederate generals are renamed. Textbooks are rewritten, this time with actual historians involved. A new generation of scholars, many of them black historians whose voices were systematically excluded before, tell the story with archival evidence and unflinching honesty. They show the receipts. They demonstrate beyond any doubt that the lost cause was always a lie, always propaganda, always in service of white supremacy. But the resistance is fierce. Because for millions of people, the lost cause isn't just history, it's identity. It's family honor. It's tradition. To admit it was a lie means confronting painful truths about their ancestors, their region, themselves. So the battle continues. In school board meetings. In state legislatures. In comment sections and cable news debates. Some people cling to the myth with desperate intensity. Others work to dismantle it piece by piece. What did this myth cost America? Generations educated in falsehood, unable to understand their own history. Racial justice delayed and denied for a century. National unity poisoned by a story that made reconciliation impossible because it required never acknowledging the truth. The same fights, over and over, because we couldn't agree on what we were even fighting about. You can't solve a problem you won't name correctly. And for 150 years, America couldn't correctly name what the Civil War was about, what the Confederacy stood for, what was lost and what was won. But here's the thing, this story isn't really about the Civil War. Not entirely. It's about what every society does with uncomfortable truths. It's about the human need for meaning after catastrophe, and the danger of collective self-deception. It's about how those in power write history, and why it matters who controls the story. The South lost the war in 1865. For years of fighting, decisively defeated. But they won the narrative for 150 years. That's longer than the Confederacy itself existed by a factor of more than 50. Think about that. The Confederacy lasted 4 years. The myth about the Confederacy dominated American consciousness for a century and a half. The myth was more powerful, more enduring, more influential than the reality it supposedly described. How did they do it? Through organization. Through institutions. Through controlling education and public symbols. Through making the myth beautiful and romantic and aspirational. Through embedding it so deeply in culture that it became invisible, just the way things are, the way they've always been. And here's what makes it relevant today, we're still doing this. All of us. Every society. Every community. Every family. We all tell ourselves stories about who we are and where we came from. Stories that make us comfortable, that justify our current positions, that avoid the hard questions. The lost cause myth teaches us how powerful those stories can be. How they can justify anything. Hide anything. Survive anything, until we decide we need the truth more than we need the comfort. And that decision? That's not easy. Because the truth is often painful. It requires admitting that people we love were wrong. That traditions we cherish are rooted in cruelty. That the stories we grew up with were lies. But myths aren't killed by facts alone. Facts have been available the entire time. The secession declarations were always public record. The Confederate Constitution was always readable. The violence of slavery was always documented. The racial terrorism of Jim Crow was always visible to anyone who cared to look. Myths die when people are finally willing to ask different questions. What is this story allowing us to do? Who does it serve? What does it cost us to keep believing it? And most importantly, what might we build if we faced the truth instead? The myth of the lost cause is dying. But it's not dead. Myths don't vanish, they fade. They loosen their grip generation by generation, uncomfortable conversation by uncomfortable conversation. Each person who learns the real history, who questions what they were taught, who chooses difficult truth over comfortable fiction, each one weakens the myth a little more. But there are still people who believe it. Still classrooms where it's taught. Still monuments that enshrine it. Still families that pass it down like an heirloom. Still politicians who exploit it. Still public spaces that honor it. The South didn't just rewrite its defeat. It showed us something about the human condition, about how desperately we need stories, how easily we deceive ourselves, how long we'll cling to comfortable lies. And it showed us something else, that myths, no matter how powerful, can be challenged. Can be questioned. Can eventually be overcome. Not easily. Not quickly. Not without cost. But it's possible. The Civil War ended in 1865. More than 160 years ago. But the battle over its memory continues. In classrooms and courtrooms. In city councils and state legislatures. In museums and monuments and movies. In families at Thanksgiving dinner, arguing about what a flag really means. This battle, this long, grinding fight over truth and memory, this is democracy too. Not the inspiring kind. Not the kind that makes good speeches. But the real kind. The kind where we collectively decide what we're willing to believe, what we're willing to excuse, what we're willing to build together. The South rewrote its defeat into mythology. Now we're writing what comes next. The story isn't over. It's never over. The only question is, what will we write? And who will we be in the story we tell? If you want more video like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button now. It helps the channel grow and you get more content like this in the near future.